we are going to go ahead and get started in our section. Welcome, everyone. This is the first plenary session of the day. Understanding the dynamics of religious persecution. And I want to introduce our three members of our panel. First of all, we have Roger Finke from the United States. He is a professor of sociology and religious studies at Penn State University and director of the Association of Religion Data Archives. He's a former president of the Association of the Sociology of Religion, and he earned his doctorate in sociology at the University of Washington and held faculty positions at Concordia College, Loyola University, and Purdue University before joining the faculty at Penn State in 2000. He is the author and co-author of books and numerous peer-reviewed articles, and he has published in 2015 a report entitled Exploring the Trends and Consequences of Religious Registration, a Global Overview. He's also a fellow of the Baylor Institute for Studies of Religion and a past president of the Association for the Study of Religion, Economics, and Culture. And then we have Professor Jónatas Machado from Portugal. He is an international law, European Union law, and tax law professor from the Faculty of Law at the University of Coimbra, thank you, and the Autonomous University of Lisbon. He's the author of several books and law articles on these and other constitutional law topics, such as freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and media law. He is a legal advisor, a member of the European Consortium on Church and State Research, a member of the list of OSCE conciliators, and a tax law arbitrator in the Center of Administrative Arbitration in Lisbon. He's executive director of the Human Rights Center of the Faculty of Law at his university, and currently an important area of his research and teaching is the anti-corruption principle as a multi-level principle in international, European, and constitutional law. And then we have Andrew Teal. The Reverend Dr. Andrew Teal has been a full member of the Faculty of Theology at the University of Oxford since 2008. Formerly, he served as admissions coordinator, disability officer, and harassment advisor, and a teacher of New Testament Greek across the university. He's a chaplain fellow and lecturer in theology at Pembroke College, Oxford. And his research interests include patristic and modern theology, Christology and ecclesiology, Eastern theology, interfaith dialogue, theology in the arts, theology and frontier spirituality, and the theology and spirituality of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He is a warden of the Sisters of the Love of God, the chair of trustees of Oxford Center, and a trustee of All Saints Sisters of the Poor. So if you will join with me in welcoming our panel today. And before I forget, there are two housekeeping pieces. The Mongolia and Sri Lanka panel is canceled for the second block of regional sessions. This was scheduled at 11:30 in room 314, so it has been canceled. And for those of you who are presenters, if you haven't sent them in, we need your presentations, your slides, your speeches, and your permission slips as soon as possible. So if you can turn those in, please. We will turn the time now over to Professor Finke.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I've heard wonderful things about this conference and very honored to be here, and especially with all the international guests. It makes it a special privilege. I have to admit that being under all these lights, I feel like I'm being interrogated, though. I can barely see all of you, but really good to be here. What I want to talk about today is the research I've been conducting over the last 15 years. I really did not intend to do international research in this area, but due to some work I was actually doing in theory on the importance of understanding how restrictions on religion affect religions themselves, I became very interested in when the State Department started publishing international religious freedom reports. Rodney Stark and I, who were co-authors on many publications, we talked about the benefits of trying to take those detailed reports and coding them up and supplementing them with other information to really provide coded up data by country so you could offer comparisons across country. Later on, an economist from Harvard, Robert Barrow, and I wrote an NSF grant to actually do that data collection. It was not funded, but then fortunately, a few years later, the John Templeton Foundation did agree to fund it. And I worked with a number of graduate students, but Brian Grimm is the one who headed up the efforts to code up the data with me. And then later on, I published a number of articles as far as with Brian, with Dane Maddock, with Jamie Harrison, with Robert Martin. And I want to just talk about some of the research we've done. And I should add that when I first began this process, I expected and certainly was aware of religious persecution around the globe. And I was certainly aware of restrictions being placed on religion, but neither I nor I think most of the people involved with me really expected it to ever be as high as it was when you actually started coding it up. One of the first figures we put together was on the level of persecution. Now, by persecution, we want to be clear. This is not simply harassment. This is not simply discrimination in mild ways. This is physical abuse, being displaced from the home, imprisoned, or killed due to religion. So we were surprised that in 43% of the countries, or over 200 incidents of this type of persecution occurring. And there were only 14% where none was reported. Now, we also coded up things like religious conflict in the countries, and we were surprised at how high that was as well. And so the question automatically became, why? What explains this high level of conflict? What explains this high level of religious persecution? Well, when we began this, probably the dominant, and perhaps still one of the dominant explanations, was Huntington's clash of civilization arguments. Now, for the sake of brevity, I'm going to be very, perhaps not do it justice, but he argued that there were cultural identities or civilizations that are identified with the world's great religions. To the extent that those religions meet, either across borders or internally within countries, conflicts will result. Okay, so whenever these civilizations meet, there's a clash. And he primarily emphasized going across country, but he said the same thing occurs within countries. So one of the things we looked at early on was, does this hold true? So one of my grad students, Jamie Harris, said, I really don't like this argument. I don't like it at all. He says, but why does it sound so right? He says, why does it seem to be right? Well, one of the reasons it seems to be right is because if you look up here on that very top bar, the blue bar, let me see if I have, no, I guess I don't. So if you look at the top, you can see that when there's internal divides, okay, when there are clashes, potential clashes between two major world religions within a country, is far more likely to have a high rate of persecution. Okay, for those with no border divides and no divides internally, it's far less likely as far as to be, or far more likely to be no religious persecution whatsoever. So to an extent, it seemed like he was right. And that bothered me as well, too. The argument which then Brian Grimm and I started to put forward is we said to the extent that government or social forces deny religious freedoms or regulate religion, religious conflict will increase. Rather than putting emphasis on the clash or the divisions, we wanted to place emphasis on to what extent was there a promise of religious freedom. In other words, it's not the divisions per se, but it's the response to those divisions that makes the difference. So, so you can have religious pluralism, have peace abide, if there's really equality across religions. And that we said that would explain the conflict and not Huntington's thesis. Now, just on a very basic level, you can see how dramatic this is. If you look at the far right-hand column, where there's severe interference with a government's right to worship, or with a congregation's right to worship. If the government interferes with religion's right to worship, the chances of there being high levels of religious persecution are 80%. Okay? 80%. So there's clearly a strong relationship between religious freedom or the lack of religious freedom and high levels of religious persecution. Now, I'm going to show you one chart, and I promise I'll never show you another one like this again, really. This is what, data nerds do. Okay, we look at this stuff, we run lots of statistics, but I think what it does do is it offers a picture of, if you look to the far, your right, religious persecution, you can see the driving force behind that was government restrictions or government regulation on religion. The other major force was social restrictions or social regulations. And social regulations help to fuel government regulations, and although the arrow doesn't show it here, social regulations also tended to increase religious persecution. The only other variables that we entered into this model that really had a direct impact on religious persecution was armed conflict and population size. And as historians have argued for a long time, religious persecution is often collateral damage from armed conflicts. And certainly that has gone through many different historical examples, and simply the size of the country makes a difference as well. Given that government restrictions are so important, we wanted to look at why. What explains where government restrictions are going to be high, or where religious freedoms are going to be low? So what explains the increased restrictions on religion? Well, first of all, let me dismiss one. Constitutional promises of religious freedom are the new standard. Before the International Religious Freedom Report was ever published, I tried to code up data on constitutions, and what I was surprised to find was the vast majority of countries promise religious freedom. Okay, it's about 90, actually over 92%. Jonathan Fox from Religion and State, his project has it somewhere 93%. We had around 90% in the project we did, but it's very high. At the same time they're routinely promised, they're also routinely denied. Dane Maddock put together this chart showing what the promises for religious freedom by Constitution, and then where there are also legal restrictions on religious freedoms. And you can tell it's not that much different. So the vast majority of countries that promise these freedoms also put legal restrictions on religious freedoms. And sometimes it's in the same constitution that promises religious freedoms, and a later clause will deny religious freedoms to an extent. So if, whoa, just a second here. Let me find my way back here. Yeah. So what I want to do is, what explains this chasm as far as between promise and practice? Why do constitutions promise this? And there's a long explanation, but let me just focus on the short one. If you look at most human rights, you find that as economics improve, as education improves, as a number of other socioeconomic measures improve in a country, you see improvement also in the enforcement of human rights. Okay, the promise of human rights is followed up with support for those human rights. That is not necessarily the case in religion, however. So I want to look at what we have found to be some of the strongest predictors. As you saw in that model, one of the strongest predictor is all the non-state actors. So to what extent are there societal pressures for governments to regulate religion? The societal pressures have put a tremendous impact on government themselves, but they also put a tremendous impact as far as in restricting religion by themselves. Some of the different ways societal restrictions can occur, these are just a few of the ones, taking these from the religion and state data collection, is they coded up countries where this type of societal restriction took place. You can see the threat of violence, 41%. Harassment of religious members, 50%. Vandalism, 57%. And each of these, for those from the United States is far from exempt in any of these. The level of harassment and the level of vandalism on religious organizations has increased sharply over the last decade. So the societal pressures is one of the first ones to explain this chasm. A second factor, as far as for denying religious freedoms, and this is one that's quite subtle in many ways, but it's the registration. This is one where the State Department actually, when we started coding this data, they started asking us questions about our findings on religious registration. Because they said what they found was one of the key explanatory things was and these were the people who collected the International Religious Freedom Reports, was registration. Now, registration for some countries is it's benign, okay? It's routine. You're required to register, but there are very few requirements. It's like registering for many other things. However, for many countries, there's strong requirements. You have to be in the country for so long a period of time. You have to have so many members. And you have to put up a lot of other requirements that make it impossible for many religions to register. And even in those countries where registration is not required, such as France would be one example, it's pretty much impossible for a religious organization to open a bank account, to rent a building, unless they are registered with the state. We also found that registration impacts the religious minorities by far the most severely, which is not a major surprise. And also, the societal pressures I talked about just a moment ago have a big impact on religious registration. Because societal pressures, well, registration is often enforced by local administrators. And that's the very area where you tend to see more societal pressures on who can be counted, who can register, and who cannot register. So quite often, even when you register with the federal government or some sort of national government, you also have to register at a local level. The societal pressures are much stronger at that level. And then finally, registration requirements are increasing, and they're increasing quite rapidly. Show you another table just to show you how this trend, just from 1990, so it's not that long of time. If you look at the very top and the very bottom, you'll see the top one is just, is there a registration process for religious organizations? You can see from 1990 to 2014, okay, so 24 years. In 24 years, it jumped from 73% to 89%. And as I said, for some of these, registration is simple. But for many, it is not. If you go down to the very bottom then, groups are officially required to register. The government enforces this and discriminates against unregistered groups. You see that jump from 22 to almost 40%. And many times, the requirements for registration are almost impossible for most religions to fill. So registration has become a very subtle one. In countries where they promise religious freedom and they advertise and can showcase even their support for many religions, there's often heavy restrictions placed through registration requirements. Another area, big area that matters is governance. Now, I know it won't come as a surprise that the judiciary, as far as this audience, is important. But the protection of religious freedoms is associated with independent judiciary. This one is especially crucial for minorities. The independent judiciary is a powerful predictor for us. And then free, fair, and open elections are associated with increased freedoms as well. However, this is a far stronger predictor for majority religions than it is for minority religions. So governance does matter. Here, as always, I always show you one table. If you look at the far right-hand side, you'll see here's where the restrictions are the highest. Now, you'll see that 89% of the countries without an independent judiciary have extensive levels of restrictions, religious restrictions. You'll see that when there's not free and fair elections, 75% of the countries have extensive level of restrictions. So governance has a major impact. And again, I'd say the judiciary is the one we find consistently, and especially if you're trying to explain minority religions. At the same time, however, a lot of past research has just talked about democracy being the panacea. There are so many different components to what it means to be a democracy that it's not automatic. First of all, the free elections. De Tocqueville, when he visited the United States many years ago in the 19th century, he argued about the tyranny of the majority. And he argued the importance of the judiciary for controlling the tyranny of the majority. And that's no less important now than it was then. The secularizing the state, one of the key things that's often cited as important as far as for ensuring religious freedoms is to secularize the state, to separate religion and state. And that is true to an extent, but that often has important implications. But many states have become so secularized that secularism itself has been in competition with religious freedoms. You see this in more and more countries where the secular ideology has become more dominant than allowing religious freedoms to exist. And you see this especially in many Western European countries right now. And finally, democracies that are an Orthodox majority, Buddhist majority, thank you, Muslim majority, and former communist states tend to have higher restrictions. With the Orthodox majority, there's a variety of reasons. One, because many of those countries are former communist nations, but there's a lot of explanations that, for each of these. But democracy alone is not the panacea. So some key findings that I want to emphasize. First, restrictions on religion are high and rising. There are 3 major data collections. All of them show these restrictions are on the rise. There's without exception. Religious freedoms serve to diffuse civilization divides. Just civilization divides are important, and they can lend themselves to conflict, but it makes religious freedoms all the more important. And it's especially important because one of the tendencies and one of the justifications by governments also is that we need to regulate religion in an attempt to reduce conflict. And the very regulation of religion itself is often what leads to that conflict. Finally, or not finally, but increased religious freedoms are associated with the reduced registration requirements, reduced societal pressures, an independent judiciary, a free and open elections. And the consequences of religious freedoms denied are, and I didn't go through this, but discrimination is a powerful one. I mainly talked about persecution, but discrimination is one Jonathan Fox has looked at extensively. All forms of discrimination, whether it be economic, whether it be, well, really just any part, as far as housing, anything, it becomes a major factor as far as with religious freedoms. Increased religious persecution is what I've emphasized here, but other research we've done has also looked at more general religious-related conflict. And religious freedoms are strong predictors of that as well, too. If I want to sum it up, I'd sum it up just in a couple lines here. First, when freedoms are uniformly secured for all, the freedoms for even the smallest minority become the freedoms for others. Okay? So when they're uniformly secured for all, the freedoms for even the smallest minority become the freedoms for others. When I was doing a book, where it was an excuse to travel around the country is what it was, but I was doing a book and taking a lot of pictures and interviewed an imam in Detroit. And one of the things he was impressed by was when a shopping mall would not allow him to rent space. And he said it was Protestant pastors and Catholic priests who came to his defense. And they said, your freedoms are our freedoms. And he says, you have every right to rent that space just as we do. And so he was very impressed, but I think it was just a basic lesson. You know, and the simple one at the very last line, if I have more motivation to support your religious freedoms when your freedoms are my freedoms. Thank you very much.
Professor Machado.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to share the floor with you. And it's a pleasure and an honor to share the panel with Jane Wise, Roger Finke, and Andrew Teal. And I have been learning a lot from you already, so let me make my modest contribution. As you know, religious freedom, as has been said, is pretty much enshrined in many constitutions and international texts around the world. But as also has been said, there is a gap between promise and performance. You know, sometimes we face headwinds when it comes to protect religious freedom. And the question is, what are these headwinds? Why do we face them? I would like to draw your attention to the theoretical dynamics of religious persecution. And I would like to point out that many legal theories and doctrines that, and models and paradigms that are dominant in the law schools and the political philosophy really can create problems to religious freedom. It's not that they have necessarily to create problems, but can create some problems if taken to some extremes. First of all, I would like to point out Republican secularism. You know, it is based on the French Revolution ideas, freedom, equality, and fraternity, the French Revolution idea of laïcité, its program of anti-clericalism and the idea of a constitution civile du clergé, which means the civil constitution of the clergy, in which the clergy has to pay obedience to the republic. Religion is considered as oppressive and irrational. The supremacy of the republic is affirmed. Sometimes this leads to confrontational secularism, in which religion is really driven out of the public square. This trend, this idea tends to deny the religious contribution to political philosophy, law, economics, and culture. So freedom of religion is pretty much a private matter. This idea is very influent in some countries in Europe. It has been also influenced for some time in Turkey until Erdogan started making some shift in this idea. Another theory that is important to consider is political liberalism. We can associate this pretty much to the work of John Rawls, a theory of justice and political liberalism. Here the emphasis on the democracy, the idea that democracy is based on equal dignity and freedom. The purpose is to build a theory of justice based on a social contract under a veil of ignorance, in which we don't know if we will be rich or poor, Christian or atheist, and things like that. And we try to devise a theory of justice that would work for everybody, regardless of the concrete situation. The notion here is the Westphalian model of primacy of politics over religion, you know, based on the European experience in which there was religious confrontation, and then politics had to put some order to avoid confrontation. It proposes a secular public reason that excludes religion as irrational and private. It tends to ignore that politics is not just about the just, but also about the good. It downplays the fact that religious convictions also have a public, legal, economic, cultural, and scientific implications. It may ignore that values that such as dignity, freedom, equality, solidarity, and justice started out as religious values. So political liberalism can be a good thing to a certain extent, but if taken to the extremes, creates a bias against the religious presence in the public sphere. And then we have another perspective, not very far from political liberalism. It's inspired in the work of a German philosopher, Jürgen Habermas, in his Theorie des kommunikatives Handeln and Faktizität und Geltung, you know, between facts and norms, something like that. The idea is that human coexistence is a discourse project. And there is the primacy of communicative reason over private reason. Communicative reason is presented as post-religious, post-metaphysical. So there is the rejection of religious discourse and worldview. You know, that's why, as it was pointed out, Europe tends to have this secularized version of the public square. The point is the search for scientific and technological solutions for world problems. This theory ignores that constitutional community is also a moral community. It downplays the religious roots of constitutional values, including the German Constitution, for instance, which in its preamble has the invocation of God. And it tends to force religious individuals to engage in a kind of secular speech language therapy, in which, in order to participate in the public square, you have to get rid of all religious invocations, all religious words and expressions. Another view is communitarianism. It's also, we can associate this to works of authors like Alasdair MacIntyre, Michael Walzer, Michael Sandel, or Will Kimlicka, and things like, and others. You know, the idea here is a reaction to political individualism. This communitarianism stresses the relevance of historical, political, social, and cultural religious context. It emphasizes positively the dignity, freedom, equality, and justice, but it says that they exist in a cultural context. It is more open to the role of traditional religion in the public sphere, but it may be less sensitive towards individual religious freedom because it stresses communitarian values. It may be also less sensitive to the needs of minority religious communities. So, you know, the relevant community here is sometimes under dispute. And it may be less sensitive to the global nature of religious communities because it emphasizes the local political community, and it downplays the fact that, for instance, the Catholic religion tends to be universal and so not necessarily linked to a particular local community. It may be suspicious towards foreign missionaries and religious communities because it sees foreign missionaries as outsiders, you know, they come to create problems to the community. So communitarianism has some positive things, and don't get me wrong, I can also see lots of positive things in all these currents, but we have to be aware because if taken to the extreme, they can pose some threat to religious freedom. Another trend is nationalist ethnopopulism. We can see this in various sides. You know, the examples of China or India have already been mentioned, but unfortunately there are many more examples rather than only those. This stresses the importance of nation sovereignty, traditional and ethnic community. It underplays the democracy and separation of powers and the rule of law. So checks and balances are downplayed, the importance of the rule of law, independent judiciary, and things like that. So governance is a problem. It stresses religious, ideological, and cultural homogeneity. There is the danger of religious, ideological, or party capture of the state, you know, in which a religion captures the state, or a party captures the state, or a state captures a religion, or a state captures a political party. It stresses the distinction between real citizens and second-class citizens or outsiders. And real citizens may be from a certain religious group or from a certain political party. And the others that don't belong to the party or don't belong to this community are seen as outsiders, not full members of the political community, and thus discriminated against and persecuted. This nationalist ethnopopulism can be a threat to individual freedom of conscience and belief, and a threat to collective and institutional rights, religious and ideological minorities. You know, there are lots, I don't have time to stress this, but there in many parts of the world that there are lots of case law that has to do with this particular lines of thought. Another legal theory that can be interesting but can also be a threat to religious freedom is the economic analysis of the law and the economic analysis of religion. As you know, economic analysis of the law stresses utilitarianism. Here you know, all Americans and many people know of Richard Posner, for instance, and other authors, but Richard Posner would be paramount. Utilitarianism, rationality, value maximization. You know, this analysis is important, of course, for contract law, regulation, antitrust law, even tax law, of course. It can be a interesting intellectual tool. It emphasizes individual choice above religious preferences. It stresses the religious marketplace of ideas. Religious freedom is seen as a kind of competition law or antitrust law of religion. You know, there is the risk of an economic and materialistic interpretation of religion. Like, for instance, Karl Marx has done that, you know, that religion is really nothing about an economic strategy to oppress the people. Many see religion as a kind of commercial and business operation. You know, Karl Marx said the same thing. For instance, when he said that in America, many pastors become businessmen and many businessmen become pastors. You know, he said that in his writing on the Jewish question. Many see religion as clergy as mere religious entrepreneurs. There is the underplaying of non-economic, theological, and moral dimensions of religion. And many consider religion, it may consider religion as irrational, inefficient discourse that prevents social progress. So some kind of inefficient thing that we must get rid of quickly. Feminist legal theory. Feminist legal theory has also the positive side of it, of enhancement of the dignity of women, the criticism of all political, legal, economic, and cultural structures that disfavor women, that denouncing of patriarchal nature of religion, and the limitation, it may lead to the limitation of religious freedom, because it says that religious freedom is about promoting patriarchal religions. It states that religious freedom promotes patriarchal religions that pose a threat to women's rights, but it downplays the importance of some religions in stressing the equal dignity of men and women. It downplays the role of religion in providing a sense of identity, purpose, and meaning to women. So here we see, you know, good ideas, but if taken to the extreme, can really pose a threat to religious freedom. Gender and sexual orientation theory. It also has the positive side of emphasizing the equal dignity of all human beings that must be treated with maximum concern and respect, but it risks substituting a view of heteronormativity by homonormativity or genderless normativity. So it challenges a certain normativity, but tries to replace it with another normativity. Gender and sex are seen as mere social constructs and a form of essentialism, but it risks replacing a social construct by another social construct, and it risks imposing a new essentialism, certain essential ideas about sex, family, gender that don't admit any other challenge. So there is the risk of restricting freedom of conscience, thought, religion, and expression. It can be a threat to individual, collective, and institutional religious expression. And as you know, litigation abounds concerning this trend. Postmodernism. You know, postmodernism is also a theory that stresses that there is no foundational truth. All truth is conventional. All truth is relative, cultural, and contextual. All religion is essentially a pre-modern convention. Religious narratives are mere social constructs. Religion has no inherent truth value. Truth is a function of utility for social purposes, and religious freedom can be restricted if that is required by prevailing social truths, conventional truths, hard truths, present truths. Since everything is relative, religion is relative, and so we can do away with it when we want. New atheism. New atheism, we connect with authors, for instance, like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, and so on, just to quote some examples. The idea here is matter is all there is and all there has always been. The universe, life, and man are the result of random blind processes. Religion and morality are part of an evolutionary process. Religion evolved from pantheism, polytheism, monotheism, and atheism. Ideas evolved from myths, dogmatism, criticism, and rational scientism. All knowledge is empirical and testable. Religion is a vestigial leftover of intellectual evolution. Religious doctrines are wrong by prevailing scientific standards. Religious doctrines are irrational, unscientific, and perverse, and thus should be abolished. So we have this idea very strong in the universities, for instance. This is, and it goes to the law schools and things like that. So, conclusion. In spite of the constitutional and international legal protection, religious freedom faces severe headwinds. Most legal theories and ideologies have positive points, but if taken to the extreme, can be used to curtail religious freedom. The dynamics of religious persecution has deep intellectual and ideological roots. These roots translate in judicial interpretations of religious freedom's norms. Although religious freedom is legally protected, there is a infrastructural dynamic of religious persecution. Religious freedom scholars must work in different fronts: legal, theoretical, and ideological. Thank you.
Reverend Teal.
Shall I switch this one off? Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be here. Undeserved, but it's great to be with you. In August of this year in Oxford, the BYU Symposium on Religious Persecution met in Christchurch. Some of you may have been there. And one of the key presences was Baroness Emma Nicholson, who, among many other awards, holds an honorary doctorate from this university for international leadership and humanitarian service. She spoke of the work of Amar Foundation, in particular concerning some of the barbaric atrocities committed on prepubescent Yazidi and Shiite girls by Islamic State. The narrative of the puzzlement of a girl was told whose family dentist was forced by Islamic State to rape her. Here was someone who had ministered in a medical way to her kindly over many years. It struck home all of the panelists, of which I was one, and at that point some photographs were taken. The photographs are, you can see in our faces the reflection of the proper interior torment of what was presented to us. Because hitherto and often we have the notion of persecution of religious practice and identity and construct that as an example of the necessity of defending religious freedom from an oppressive external power or state. Think about some of the more famous, well, many examples. Individuals like Cardinal Józef Mindszenty, who opposed fascism in the Second World War and then communism thereafter, and who was tortured and given a life sentence and imprisoned effectively in the United States Embassy as in asylum, despite a United Nations resolution. And against the individual, we have some more extraordinary and sad examples. China's post-revolutionary persecution of the Catholic Church, its contemporary re-education of interred Muslims, the treatment of the Falun Gong, and many more. How in 1930s Germany, I was told in a conversation over this weekend, that school children arrived at school one morning to be told that they were no longer Germans, but now, and I quote, only Jews. Think of Executive Order 44 of Governor Lilburn Boggs, that notorious extermination order in these United States, which triggered the displacement, persecution, and murder of the outcast's outcast, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that continues in the United States with outbursts against vulnerable minorities into the 20th century, the Elsinore riots against Jehovah's Witnesses in 1940, for example. In other words, these examples and many others, when the state controls all the activities of a church or fails to prioritize the protection of religious minorities from the mob, the motivation of dictators and government seeks to rid themselves of that uneasy sense that their grasp on authority is brittle and undermined by an agency that they can neither understand nor influence. Savage suppression, propaganda, the installation of fear in those least able to see the big picture results in attacks or sustained persecution of those most feared and least understood, as we have just been shown with extraordinarily clarity, for which I'm very grateful and want to have a look at those figures and take them away and reflect on them. The state so often seeks to overstretch itself and its legitimacy by claiming dominion over minds as well as bodies and actions, over thought rather than what we do. It is the important role of scholarship and of collaboration between legal and other academic disciplines to evaluate critically and to push these dynamics more deeply. But as dreadful as these examples are throughout the world, the turmoil in our hearts and minds on that panel in the Oxford Conference was the dark and deeper epiphany that religions and their adherents are as vulnerable as anyone else to the cycles of fear and reprisal. It is therefore also our duty and our responsibility to understand religious traditions and violence within them. It is tempting, when faced by the vile examples rehearsed by Baroness Nichols, to concur with some of those objections of which we heard articulated so well, with the objections of clinical and cognitive behaviorists. Albert Ellis wrote this: religiosity is in many ways equivalent to irrational thinking and emotional disturbance. The elegant therapeutic solution to emotional problems is to be quite unreligious. The less religious they are, the more emotionally healthy they will be. This is strongly and convincingly contested by Daniel K. Judd of this university, which is just as well, of course, because the vast majority of people on our planet remain adherents to religion, and simply to write it off as mental ill health will not help. Again, making the tasks of careful and nuanced understanding and dialogue imperative. Now, in my own area of research and writing, the life and development of doctrine in early Christianity and late antiquity, examples of diverse persecution, as well as perhaps deliberate neglect to protect Christian communities, are well rehearsed. Why were Christians distrusted in that era? And do any of the particular reasons help us to set alongside some of the examples or to add a sort of historical complement? Various late antique writers and subsequent scholars outline some reasons why they believe Christianity was suspect, including it was founded by a convicted criminal. Its adherents were disowned by their mother culture, the Jewish community, and therefore excluded from the protective veil of their status of having a licit religion. It represented the abandonment of tradition, of traditional religion, and the subsequent irritation of the gods, inviting chaos. It represented a social challenge In particular, in contrast to some of the critiques that we heard, women found an extraordinary alternative to what they found to be oppressive. Interesting, isn't it? To being married or by requirement into other families for political allegiances, the option of consecrated life as single women or in communities, as well, of course, as the assertion that slaves and free are all counted equals in this fellowship, social challenge. Christians exhibited no fear when they were threatened with death. This was a sort of exasperated accusation against Christians. And rather than this being seen as bravery, on the contrary, it was counted as evidence of intolerance, extremism, and a low evaluation of mortality and society. That is, they were saying truth is something very different from the function of utility, of which we just heard. It was a self-deceit of the empire. No doubt the Senate and Romans believed it to be true, but that doesn't stop it being a deceit, that Roman law was a civilizing force against barbarism. If you read some of the poets, the pastoral poets of the Augustan era, Roman law is romanticized. In reality, if you were not a Roman, it was brutal, absolutist, and oppressive. Another gap between promise and performance, as we've seen. Another scholar, an Orthodox scholar, John Bear, notes with a degree of puzzlement that Roman authorities were particularly annoyed when in times of catastrophe or plague, the Roman government abandoned communities. But Christians often remained to nurse and to tend the sick, even at great personal risk. Sweet injuries indeed to the state, but nevertheless displeasing and challenging to pagan authority, made them look bad. So these factors then contributed, among others, to different fortunes of the early Christian community. Everyone thinks they know that Rome persistently persecuted the Christians until Constantine, but the picture is more complex. There is, of course, the mad maverick emperor, often depicted in film, and that feeds the popular imagination. Nero, the psychopath, burning the slums of Rome as a backcloth for the plays that he'd composed, and blaming the Christians for such urban terrorism. But there are other examples amid the complexity. Strenuous attempts to manage and placate communities is evidenced, and this is witnessed in puzzled correspondence between Pliny, the provincial governor, seeking imperial advice. And he's counseled effectively, don't ask, don't tell. If citizens are accused of Christianity or immorality, then yes, investigate. But any pernicious claims, knock them on the head. They will draw punishment themselves. And if people are found to be Christians, then they are to be given the opportunity to demonstrate their loyalty to the state by easy sacrifice, just some pieces of incense on an altar to the genius of the emperor. But it was something to which most Christians could not conscientiously conform. We see occasional sporadic localized persecution, which is not necessarily state-sponsored, but which the state then feels it has to interfere with. It was often brutal. In Vienne and Lyon in France in 177, there was legitimate concern for the peace and stability of the empire at riots which were possibly race-orientated. Well, there were then further, understandable perhaps, but albeit immorally, more empire-wide suppression of Christianity by the emperors Decius in 250 and Diocletian from 302 of the Common Era. The unity of the empire in the face of external threats from Persia in the east and Germanic tribes in the north remained a concern. And it did for Constantine, but his strategy, famously, was to try to enroll the Christian community as spiritual auxiliaries in the task of uniting empire and society. So the Edict of Milan in 313 brought the end, to some degree, or the end to some Christians of persecution. But it unfurled a host of reactions which continued to impact upon the Christian community and wider society. The organization of the Christian community in league, now with imperial and local authorities, led to greater coordination, involvement with church building, education, hospitals, and welfare collaboration. But it also resulted in repercussions for the Jewish and pagan communities. And in North Africa, traditional Carthaginian hostility to Rome gave way to schism of Donatism and Miletian groups. Local violence led to the use of imperial power to quell now Christians in the name of the church. But on a note of hope, there were examples of key figures who worked for mutual respect in this period. High among them, Origen, whose own brilliant, if troubled, life led him to appreciate the rabbis around him in Caesarea. Perhaps one of the first early Christian fathers to read and study together with rabbis, exploring what Scripture meant. It's a rare but wonderful example of dialogue before his own torture and death in state persecution around 251. It's also true to say that before and after Constantine, many did not seek tolerance. The Emperor Julian, the apostate, found it easy to provoke every party by simply causing chaos, returning all of the buildings to their original owners before Constantine had built new things. And that caused chaos and violence. But there were also rare examples of friendship and advocacy, of a just, lawful, mutual protection. This sort of notion that the Romans had about a civilizing influence. Let's have law as something stable. That same impulse to engage and to understand might yet slowly move us out to mitigate against attitudes and acts of violence marked by the impunity today. All of these statistics really reflect that sense of there being impunity, and this has to be addressed. But that's not the same as vengeance. The hug it out controversy, which I call in the United States this week, in a court, Brandt Jean, I think that's how we pronounce it, embraced Amber Geiger, convicted of the killing of his brother. It was incredibly moving to see on the television. And it's illuminated an attitude that gives us an agenda to explore. Mercy and justice are so often conceived as polar opposites. Ultimately, mercy as a human construct can't have a place for justice. And perfect justice, if it's perfect, can't be moderated by mercy. And that is true, but only if those are human constructs, arguments, or ideas. Isaiah Berlin made that argument as a philosopher. But as a theologian, if, perchance, mercy and justice are divine attributes into which humanity, the families of human beings are invited, then we might yet find a stronger impulse towards truthful mercy, the restoration of a tenderness and appropriate intimacy in public and personal life. So think of Desmond Tutu's Truth and Reconciliation process after South African apartheid as an example. It's deeply painful and traumatic, but absolutely necessary that those stories in all their horror were retold and faced to avoid either a desire to just be a desire for impunity, or a desire of revenge. Pope St. John Paul II was criticized by very many for his great interfaith initiatives at Assisi to try to build between the religions and their leaders not only a mutual understanding, but a mutual affection, a desire for mutual defense one of another. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is often suspected as surreptitiously undergoing mission in its humanitarian work. I may have got this wrong, but I think at General Conference, President Nelson recalled that to date, 10 billion US dollars has been given in humanitarian aid to people regardless of faith, race, gender, sexual orientation. And its hosting of ambassadors, and in fact, this very meeting, can make some people quite suspicious of motives. But it can be an ensign that where we are stuck as human beings in patterns of violence and suspicion need not be our ultimate destiny. And cynically, of course, we can write off these attempts as merely being nice, if not surreptitious mission, or rather covering deeper, rigid attitudes. But the wild hope of human flourishing can be sensed as a counter-impulse to the violence which we so tragically heard depicted in Oxford, showing not a twisted religious psychopathology, but the surprising, gracious possibility that people of different faiths, not sharing the same ideology, but sharing a common humanity and a common commitment to truth and to values of protection and love, can offer a paradigm of faith, not as a violent model, but to protect and promote all human rights, religious liberty together, where law and grace can together combat terror. There is, therefore, I truly believe, a place for a post-secular communicative reasoning of which we heard, where religious poetry, language, and imagination are allowed as part of the rich tapestry of that network of communication of what it is, the mystery to be human. This theological communicative reasoning, speaking together of God in public, is the basis of scholarship and is to be the energy promoting people of all faiths as exhibited in this great collaborative symposium year on year. It is not an optional extra for the elite. It is rather our duty and our sacred obligation to look these facts in the eye and with hope take the long view and make a strong commitment to prioritize the absolute basis of tolerance and justice, to move towards mutual advocacy and accountability, to build increasing friendship, to allow forgiveness and justice, and to restore the dignity of each person.
I want to thank the members of the panel. It looks like we have time for one or maybe two questions. Yes. We have a microphone coming.
Okay, thank you so much. I just would like to have some short comments regarding the strict application of the principle of secularism and its confrontation with the religious freedoms, as both Professor Rager and Jonathan mentioned in their speech. And Turkey is a good example in this sense. In 1980s and 19s, the secularism was enforced in a way to deny religious freedoms. But in early 2000s, there was a change, and this is shifted toward more religious freedoms. But I want to clarify that this change was not only about due to Erdogan. The other state institutions and judiciary, particularly the Constitutional Court of Turkey, played a major role in this. Of course, the Erdogan and the political party became the symbol, perceived as a symbol. But also, not only Muslims, but also other minority groups Armenian Christians and Alawites. Alawis, an unpopular sect of Islam in Turkey, they have also benefited from this move toward religious freedoms. And lastly, this shift from secularism toward the freedoms was not necessarily a move toward more piety or conservatism. Indeed, the research and the statistics in Turkey demonstrated otherwise. I mean, in the last decade, the conservatism and the piety was in decline in Turkey, especially among young people. So in our example, at least we can say that in Turkey, under oppression, people are more faithful to their beliefs. But when the restrictions are relaxed, it's kind of the piety or the conservatism weakens. Thank you.
Thank you. Any members of our panel want to comment on this situation in Turkey? Okay. We have time for another question. Good. Wait for the microphone. Here it comes.
Thank you. I am Tore Lindholm from Norway. I have a small question to Jónatas Machado, if that is a good way of mispronouncing your name. I think we have had 3 excellent presentations and very different. My comment to you is that it was really fun to go through these various approaches to religious freedom. I happen to know Professor Habermas well, and I think maybe you have read earlier works of him, you mentioned them, but he's now 90 and he's changing all the time. So I'm just asking you to look into, and everybody here to look into, the new version of Communicative Ethics, which comes out in a volume now in November, and it has 1,700 pages, German. Good reading. I think he has changed his view on the legitimacy of religion in politics. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Professor Machado.
Yes, it's true. Actually, Jürgen Habermas is very much quoted when defending the post-secular world, because there was a shift. He tends to be more accepting of religion in the public square. He senses that there is a need, you know, the naked public square really doesn't satisfy everything. But of course, you had to admit that in 15 minutes, I cannot do justice to the thinking of Habermas or any other. Okay.
Thank you. We are about out of time. If you would join with me in thanking our panelists again.